Hello there, everyone, and welcome to the Real Life Practice Podcast. I'm Teresa McCloy.
And I'm Lindsay Sturkey, and we are excited to welcome you into our conversation about what it means to practice our faith in our ordinary, everyday life. In every season of this podcast, we explore a different spiritual practice together that will help us connect with God and become more of who He has created us to be.
We'll talk about spiritual growth, explore our life story, and discover how to pay attention to God in the ordinary and extraordinary moments of our days. And this season, it's about the practice of retreat and how that invitation to get away and to create space for connecting with God. So, welcome into our conversation. So, Lindsay, today on this second episode in this series, we wanted to dive into just a little bit of our own personal journeys with retreat and the experiences that we have had. And just to clarify a little bit before we go too far, when we talk about the word retreat, we're looking at it through the lens of a spiritual retreat, something that you're practicing in your spiritual growth. And I know for both of us, learning how to go on retreat, be in retreat, has been a journey. So let's start first with kind of your own story of what's been your experience as you look at retreat through the lens of a spiritual retreat.
When I think about my experience of retreat growing up, we often would have retreats with our youth group, for example, that were called a retreat. Yet it feels very different from the practice of spiritual retreat that we're talking about in this season. But I think there's still a connection there. And there's things that I notice about that experience that still connect to how I practice it today. So when we would go on retreats with our youth group, it was with a big group of people. And a lot of the time was not that quiet, reflective space that I think of now when I think of a retreat. There was group times of teaching and music and games and lots of energy and loudness. And, it was very much with other people. You go on retreat, there can be that community component as well. But I also remember being on those youth group retreats, and there was that time in the morning where they would encourage you to go off with your Bible and have time with God. And I can remember sitting out. There was a place we went to that was in the mountains, and I would sit in front of this lake on this little bridge with my Bible and my journal and look out at the mountains. And those are the times that stand out to me of just such deep connection with God, even at a young age. It was definitely that practice of getting away, and the time together felt different than our normal life. And the purpose was to connect with God and to grow
Mhm.
in Him. And so, even though there was a lot of it that was different than what I practice today, I think that was still an early experience of what it meant to get away with God.
I had much of the same experience. I'm very grateful for the foundational growing up years that I had with great youth group leaders and those that invited, whether that was church camp or youth events. Until you and I started talking about this, I hadn't really connected those dots as being formational in the idea that you take specific time away. I know even at our church locally, you and I both go to the same local church, and they're talking right now about raising some funds and doing some things for kids to go to camp and for kids to go to these retreats. As I was sitting there a couple of Sundays ago in worship, that came up for me as you and I were doing the series of thinking, wow, those were formational times for me, 40 years ago, even as I look back 40, 50 years ago and going to church camp every summer for a week, much like you, having those experiences where we were encouraged to go away and sit by a tree in the morning and maybe again around campfire at night and really to be with God personally, even though all the stuff that you just described was going on of the games and the fun and the swimming and the craziness of being with a group of kids, there were still adults that were encouraging us to form something in ourselves. So that definitely resonated for me. And I even saw a greater value when I heard it in my local church to go, what if by donating funds for these kids to go, it forms in one of these kids that same thing? I see the thread in my own story. And maybe if you're listening in, you didn't have that experience, but maybe you're able to give it to your kids or to offer it to your grandkids or something like that. And it's not too late to start, whether you had the experience that Lindsay and I did or not in those early years. How do you think that grew in you then, Lindsay, say in young adult before kids? What was that season like?
I think my first experience of retreat, like I experience it today, was in my early 20s when I was part of a church leadership program that was very focused on cultivating the inner soul of the leader. And so we were encouraged to go off and spend time in solitude with God. And so we would go for a half day or a full day to a nature preserve or by a lake or very similar to things that I do now. That was my first taste of that, of what would it look like to go and spend several hours in silence and solitude away from my everyday space and routine, simply to be with God and connect with Him. And we did have times that we would do longer where we'd do an overnight away as a community, as a group that had times together and times in solitude. But even having that more regular practice of longer extended time with God in a retreat type setting, even if it was for part of the day, was a new experience for me and something that really formed my relationship with God. That was very much just be with God, be in His presence, remove everything else, all distractions, and simply be with Him. And it was something that was really pivotal in my own spiritual growth and development.
I would say, unfortunately, probably in my 20s and even into my 30s, I had a very dry period of those kinds of retreats. It doesn't mean I didn't long for them. I just didn't pay attention in the way that I wished I would have or knew that I even needed. I craved being away. So I've always enjoyed travel. I've always enjoyed getting away. But those 2 decades, my 20s and 30s, felt pretty dry in the idea of, "Oh, I go and get away with God by myself." And I look back and go, and the fruits of that in my life were probably showing up. We were walking in that season of infertility. We were walking in a season of adopting of our 2 children, of raising our son at that time. That season, those 20 years or so, felt a little dry and longing and desire, but not really having those times away. You may be listening in and can relate to this too. Even some guilt around if I would have gone away, that would have felt very selfish to be by myself or whatever. And so I just didn't. I didn't practice anything in that regard. Then I moved into ministry and I was in a kind of an entrepreneurial season, doing a lot of things from home and work and businesses from home and things like that. And then I moved into ministry part time on staff at a church and kind of came back into a rhythm of going to church camp as a adult leader and spending several weeks in the summers at church camp. Maybe I remember one time I did 2 weeks in a row. That was crazy. But yet it felt I reconnected back to that time when I went as a child and was away, but still felt like I was serving and doing things. And it really fed my soul to be back in that kind of retreat, church camp retreat type setting, even though I was with kids and had some responsibilities. I had a lot of alone time too, and a lot of time to get away and go for walks and hikes and things. So I think that kind of started to stir in me a desire again for that in my own life. What started to form in you? So you had that experience young, but then did it stay in those experiences or what happened then
Well,
to that?
a big shift, and you kinda named this for yourself even, was once I had kids, it obviously becomes much harder to get away, especially when they're young. If you don't those of you who don't know, we adopted twin newborn babies. So, that takes a lot of time and energy and makes it more difficult to get away, and so that's why I think it's so important to name your season because it's
Mhm.
gonna look different in different seasons. Back when the girls were younger, it was much harder to get away, and so I had to look for those pockets of time that I could have silence and solitude or that I could go to a local space for part of the day, and that's where we have to get creative, right? We have to ask for help, ask for support, look for those times that we maybe Tyler can be with them part of the day and I can go off and then he can do another day, It's making it work with your season. But Like you said, when those kind of busier years, there was a desire and a longing to get away, but also knowing that I couldn't have it in the way that I fully desired in the reality of my season, and
Mhm.
knowing that that was okay. That
Yeah.
that even if it couldn't look in the ideal, there was still a way to bring it into my everyday life in a way that worked with my current season.
I think we're naming something that probably anyone listening in can relate to. There are seasons as we, work with One Life maps and use those maps, especially map number 2, to kind of story time, storyline out your story. You might want to do this with something just as simple as your seasons of retreat, your ability to practice some of these spiritual practices of just to name it, just to say, like, I couldn't do it in that season, but yet God was there and God walked with me in it and God provided. You may be walking in a season right now where, as we're talking about retreats, you're kind of like, right, in what reality? And that's okay. Just lean in and know that the desire and longing is there. And what could you do? What are the small ways that you could practice? For me, then I think the next biggest shift was as I was serving then at another location in a church and was in full-time ministry, I was introduced to a program called the Transforming Center. I started working with a spiritual director, didn't know that's what he was at the time. I write about that in my book, but he invited me to be a part of this community. And through that, it was something that every 90 days or so, you went away to Chicago, Illinois, and you were on retreat. Now, there was learning and there was teaching, but you practiced silence and solitude for the first several hours that you were there. And I learned the rhythm of retreat and the invitation to come away. And it was a very hard season of our life. So as we were walking with our son and in his addiction and all of these things. And many times I would go to those retreats and literally weep the entire time I was gone because I'm also in a leadership role. And so it was that invitation to take off my leadership hat and go be a soul in God's presence. And I needed that so desperately to survive that season. It was also a season of discernment as I got to the end of some of that. What's next? What should I be moving into? All of those types of things. Retreats really, really became vitally important to me and still are. And that probably started in my mid 40s, late 40s, early 50s as I moved into some of that desire and longing. And now I can't imagine not practicing some type of retreats. We've even built it into our rule of life process that we have, the real life process that I write about in the book of just that idea of God's invitation to come away with me. But it started with something that I signed up for, a program that I was a part of and that the church had sponsored me to go to that really was so life-giving in that season.
Yeah, I resonate with that because I know for me now, what retreat looks like is that I am part of a program that is doing spiritual direction training. And we have every other month during the academic year, we have a retreat at the Springs, which you introduced me to. I know is one of your favorite places in the world and that you
Yes.
retreat at, where Sybil Towner is the co founder of that retreat space. And being in that space, it's just a few days every couple of months. And like you said, it's a program where there's teaching and discussion and community, but there's also times to go for walks in the woods and to be in solitude and in nature with God. And that has been such a life-giving rhythm for me to have that space. And then I'm in a season of life now that my kids are school age, there's more flexibility. I still have to be intentional to create that space, but I'm in a season where I'm able to make that happen, and that's been such a life-giving rhythm for me to have an environment that is outside of my everyday that I get away, be with God, and it's been so refreshing for me to have that. It's a rhythm that I know even when this program ends, I want to continue in
Yeah.
some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, as you mentioned, the Springs, that was my next act of I left the TC program after being in the program and then volunteering with the program and being a part of helping to lead a cohort and those types of things, and then moving into spiritual direction training, which created for me because I really was longing and desiring, okay, what's next? And I still probably was in a season where I didn't trust myself to do it without a program. And so if you're in that season where you're like, how could I be in a rhythm of retreat? Maybe you want to look for a program that brings you that. Even if like you're doing spiritual direction training, I've done that. I've done TC. There are lots of programs. We're actually going to have some guests on here coming up that lead those types of programs. There is something about committing financially, committing time-wise. We talk a lot about it in our rule of life process, the idea of pre-deciding. I'm going to pre-decide that retreats are a part of my spiritual growth and I'm going to practice it. And how I'm going to practice it is I'm going to trust someone else to provide the program and the structure. There's some great books out there. Ruth Haley Barton, one of my favorite authors, has a great book about retreats and being on retreat and how to do that. Oh, look, if you're watching on YouTube, yeah, Invitation to Retreat is Ruth's book. There's great resources in there. So don't be afraid to say, I need a program. I needed a program. I needed structure. I needed to have the dates pre-decided on my calendar so that I could make all the intentional. If not, I wouldn't have gone. Just like something comes up with the kids, or to be honest, every time I went to Transforming Center, and even when I went for spiritual direction, our son Eric always had a crisis every time I went. If I had not had it pre-decided, I would not have gone. So if you're in that season where there's no way I could go on retreat, let go and let God have it. And maybe that is what you need, is a structured program rather than, well, maybe I will, maybe I won't. So I think that's something that both you and I have experienced. I know you had some hesitation even when you signed up for spiritual direction training of like, can I make this work with the girls? Can my family navigate it? Who's going to take care of them, pick them up, all those things. And yet it's worked and you figured it out. And yeah.
I feel like it is an act of trust when you
Mhm.
schedule this time with God, of knowing that it's the idea of Sabbath. When we say, I'm trusting that I can stop working for a day and God still has it.
Yes.
This world will keep turning. Everything will still keep going. And I think retreat is similar, where we are saying, I am trusting God that He is going to meet me in this space, that He is going to take care of the things and the people that I am walking away from during that time. And I'm
Mm.
trusting that He is forming something in me that is going to make me show up in those spaces as a more whole person. And so it's taking that big picture look of, I am trusting God that as I step away, that He is in the spaces that I'm leaving.
Yeah. And I will say this too, for both of us, we're evolving. We don't know what our next season of life will look like with retreat. Certain practices rise up and become very important in certain seasons. And so that's why we're doing these series of all these different kind of practices and having conversations. We want to give you resources and ways. I think one of the actions I would invite you to out of this one is timeline your own story. You might be surprised where you're like, "Oh, yeah, that was a way that I learned how to go away with God," or "I've never had that." Like, my line is, "There's nothing until here," or "There's nothing at all, and I wanna put some dots on the map. I want some dots on." And then the other thing, and we'll put some things in the show notes, make sure you listen in on the next episode as we interview even some friends of ours that will come on and share about how they lead even one-day retreats. And we'll put some notes together for you too of places you might go on retreat, programs that you could be involved in, those types of things, because that might be the action step you need to take, is just to start looking and praying and discerning if something like that would be something good for you. Even our own coaches community, we certify other coaches in the process of the real life process in the work that we do. Even that we have built in the rhythm of retreats. We have 2 retreats a year that we invite our coaches to. And for many of them, that is a time, it's a sacred time for them to come away and be, again, teaching and learning are involved, but it's a rhythm for them. So there's lots of ways to lean into the rhythm of retreat.
Well, we'd encourage you to check the show notes for our free download. Teresa mentioned we have resources for you of ideas for how to set up your own retreat, places that you can connect with organizations that do retreats, all kinds of resources there for you. So check out that free download. We're on YouTube now. So if you want to find us on YouTube, we have a link to our YouTube channel that you can find the podcast there. Also, want to let you know that our real life practice membership community is available to you. That is something that we have a group of people who are interested in growing their faith in their everyday, ordinary life. And we have live calls together. We have a private chat space, resources. This is a great time to join. It's always open to join, but starting in July, we're beginning a new book study together through a book called Journey of the Soul that talks about stages of faith and what it looks like to take your next step of growth based on the season you're in and the journey that you're on. And so this is a great time to join. So check that out in the show notes as well. But that's an amazing group of people that are pursuing these types of practices together. So make sure to check that out if you want to connect further with our community.
Yeah, we are always excited to just do these practices together in community. So lots of ways for us to connect. And we hope you'll join us next time as we listen to Jesus' invitation to learn the unforced rhythms of grace in our everyday, ordinary life. We'll talk soon.